Today I'm setting up this CZ457 synthetic in 2-2 rimfire with a rifle scope. Here's a couple of tips and pointers about how I'm going to do it in this particular circumstance. So first of all, make sure the rifle is unloaded, take the bolt out, makes everything simple and easy. This has an 11mm rail and I've got a 30mm element optic scope to fit on it. So what I need to do, that's a 50mm objective lens. I need to make sure that A, the rings are high enough so that I'm not in contact with the barrel and I've got sufficient clearance. And B, I need to make sure my eye relief is set correctly so that when I address the rifle, I get the full focus field of view with no vignettes in my eye line. The scope rings I'm going to use are the worn steel rings. These are compatible with a 9 to 11mm dovetail rail, similar to what you'd see on any rimfire or air rifle. The first thing we've got to do is take the top off the rings once we've got them out of the packet. Being careful not to lose any of the T15 torque screws used to put them together. So I'll do that over one of the little pockets in the gun vise so that nothing can drop away. And then I'll put those on the rifle in the approximate position, just nipped in place, roughly where I think I'm going to need them. So those are just nipped in place. I'm just going to place the scope carefully on top. And what we find is we've got about 3mm clearance between the barrel and the objective body. I wouldn't probably go any smaller a gap than that, but it is good to have your scope as low as is comfortable to keep the axis of the bore line and on the optical line as close as possible. And it also means you don't need super high adjustable cheek pieces or anything like that. Now, because the tops of these rings actually go over centre and have to spring apart slightly when they go over the tube, if they're not going to go easily, it can help just to slide a piece of paper under each side. But these worn rings have got very cleverly chamfered internal corners on them, so you can click them down and they won't damage the scope tube. So I'm just going to align those back with the rings now, and I'll start fastening things back together. I would always recommend spacing the rings themselves as widely apart as possible, just to give the most support to the scope tube in use through recoil. Believe it or not, it's not actually the recoil in a linear way that damages scopes. What damages scopes is the fact that if you ever see this in slow motion, the whole action and rifle bends like a wave when it fires, and that means that the scope itself bends with it. I'm working slightly above myself here just to make it easier to film. So you can see we're on there, and we've got clearance at the front and clearance at the back end here as well, but the eye relief and position of the rings isn't probably optimum. So I'm just going to address the rifle now and have a look through the scope. So after just looking through the scope, I'm in about the right place for eye relief, but I want to bring this rear ring backwards a little bit because it looks unusually spaced forward there. So making sure it's slackened off. I can bring that back to about there. Now, this Wheeler torque wrench is set at 2 Newton meters. And it should bleep when it's correctly tensioned, as you could hear there. And now my scope's in position. It's approximately in correct linear position, but I need to set the vertical of the reticle. People all tend to have different opinions on this. The system I go with is I make sure the vertical 6 o'clock stadium of the reticle strikes through the centre of the bore line. So if I'm looking from the back through the rifle, everything looks lined up. Different people will have different ways of doing it. That's what works for me. Nobody's ever picked up one of my rifles and immediately said, your reticle's not straight. You go with what you know. Little tip now, if you turn the magnification up to maximum, which reduces the exit pupil to its smallest level, and then stand back from the rifle and lower yourself down, you can actually see a very small dot of light aligned in the centre of this tube, and it's a lot easier to do with a human eye, which wants to naturally line things up. You then line that up with the reticle poking through it and then the bore below it, and believe you me, when you actually come back to the rifle, every time it will look as straight as a die. Okay, so everything's just nip tight, nothing's heavily tensioned or torqued into place at the moment. I'm just working on opposing sides of each ring, nipping them in place with just my fingertips on the Torx key, which means that the scope itself won't twist as the ring tightens. Quality scope mounts don't need to be super tight, but most of them will actually have a torque setting specified. But what you'll generally find is that they'll close into position, you'll feel the actual metal surfaces, tension against each other, but you won't have to bend them into position. And when it comes to it, everything's nipped in place. You're happy with the alignment. All you have to do, take your torque wrench and very gently continue to do one side and then the other until it hits the required torque. As you heard there. And that's it. These are just twin bolt rings. If you have 4 bolts, it won't make sense to go front, back, left and right, diagonally backwards and forwards. If you have 6 bolts on the top of each ring, or 6 screws on top of each ring, do the 2 centre ones first. When everything's correctly positioned, then start working on the outer front, rear, left, right as well, and keep moving in that cross pattern to ensure that tension is applied evenly and never in one place more than anywhere else. All I have to do now is put the bolt back in and go zero the rifle.